The Texas sun cast its golden rays over the prestigious campus of Westfield High, a school known for its elite student body. Shiny sports cars lined up in front of the gates, and a group of white students stepped out in neat uniforms, polished shoes, and expensive designer backpacks slung casually over their shoulders. Among them, Jacob Miller, a 13-year-old black boy, stood out like a sore thumb. He didn't arrive in a luxury car or wear designer clothes. Instead, Jacob appeared in a simple shirt, faded jeans, and boots caked with mud, evidence of a hard morning's work on his family's farm. He carried an old, worn-out backpack and had calloused hands from labor. As Jacob walked through the hallways, contemptuous glances swept past him. Whispers followed him like a shadow. "Oh my God, he's walking into school with muddy boots. Gross. Does he really think he belongs here? Why did they even let someone like him in?" Jacob had heard these words enough times to know how they were said. He tried to ignore them, but the sting was always there. Suddenly, a foot stuck out to block his path. Jacob stopped, realizing a group of students was standing right in the middle of the hallway. At the front was Ethan Carter, a blond boy with sharp blue eyes and a smug half-smile. Ethan was the son of a real estate mogul, raised with everything except compassion. He tilted his head, pretending to be surprised. "Oh my, who's this?" "A farmer who wandered into the world of the educated." The group burst into laughter, the sharp, mocking sounds echoing through the hallway. Another boy beside Ethan, Andrew, crossed his arms, glancing at Jacob's muddy boots before shrugging in mockery. "Guess he must have just finished milking cows and ran over here." Jacob clenched his lips, trying not to react. He knew well that confronting Ethan and his group would only make things worse. But Ethan wasn't done yet. He stepped closer, lowering his voice in a provocative tone. "Hey, farmer boy, early bird, huh? Did someone wake you up with the rooster crow this time?" The laughter exploded again, a few other students joining in. Jacob gripped the straps of his backpack, took a deep breath, and stepped aside, avoiding the group. But Ethan didn't like that. "Hey, I didn't tell you to go." A hand reached out, pushing hard against Jacob's shoulder. Jacob staggered but didn't fall. He stopped, took a deep breath, and then looked straight into Ethan's eyes. No anger, no fear, just a quiet resolve. That discomforted Ethan. No one laughed anymore. The air hung heavy with tension. For a moment, it seemed like Ethan might say something else, but then the bell rang for class. Jacob turned and walked away, leaving the laughter behind. Jacob hurried down the long hallway, leaving behind the mocking laughter and derisive glances. He entered the history classroom and made his way to his usual seat in the back corner. The front rows were filled with the familiar faces of the city's elite children, those who had grown up attending private prestigious schools and had never known the meaning of manual labor. For them, Jacob's presence was something foreign and beneath them. The door to the classroom opened, and the sound of high heels clicking against the tiled floor immediately silenced the room. Miss Whitmore stepped in, carrying herself with the authority of someone who believed she held absolute power in the classroom. She always entered like this, with cold, sharp eyes, stiff gestures, and a commanding voice that left students no choice but to obey. But Jacob knew that behind that exterior was a person full of prejudice, someone who judged students solely based on their backgrounds and never hid her contempt for people like him. She placed her lesson plan on the desk, adjusted her rimless glasses, and scanned the room. Her eyes lingered on Jacob for a moment before she spoke. "Today, we're going to talk about the American Civil War." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was powerful, each word echoing in the stillness of the classroom. She looked around as though searching for a target, and then, like a cat picking out the weakest mouse to toy with, she called out Jacob's name, stretching it with a tone full of hidden meaning. "Jacob." He flinched slightly, his dark brown eyes lifting. A chill ran down his spine. He wasn't surprised to be called on. This had happened too many times before. Miss Whitmore liked to pick on him, and he knew she wasn't simply trying to test his knowledge. "Do you know what this war was about?" The room fell silent, and all eyes slowly shifted toward Jacob. He felt his heart pounding louder in his chest. He lowered his gaze, pretending to flip through his notebook, desperately trying to find an answer. He knew about the Civil War, but after what had just happened outside, His mind felt like a blank page. He stammered, about to say something, but before he could speak, a mocking laugh interrupted. "Oh, I forgot." Miss Whitmore's voice lingered, dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you don't need to care about American history after all. Your ancestors never learned it, did they?" The class froze for a moment then, as if someone had flipped a switch. Laughter erupted. A few students pretended to cover their mouths, but their eyes gleamed with amusement. Others turned to each other, raising their eyebrows as if they had just witnessed something highly entertaining. Jacob felt his face burning, as though someone had thrown a bucket of hot water at him. His throat tightened, and he couldn't bring himself to speak. Miss Whitmore crossed her arms, her face showing no hint of regret or remorse. No hesitation, no sign of awkwardness. She knew exactly what she had said, and she had said it with clear intention. Jacob looked down at his hands. His fingers tightened into fists, his knuckles turning white. He could feel a surge of rage building in his chest. He wanted to fight back, to stand up and declare that he knew American history better than anyone else in that room, that his ancestors had fought and bled for the rights they now had. But he couldn't, because he knew that if he did, it would only give them more reasons to see him as someone who didn't know his place. He swallowed the humiliation that was rising in his throat and remained silent. But inside him, a fire had begun to ignite. Anger flared up like a fierce fire inside Jacob, burning away all the patience he had tried to maintain throughout the morning. Miss Whitmore's words weren't just an insult. They were a knife stabbing straight into his self-respect, into things he had tried to ignore but had never truly forgotten. He sprang up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, cutting through the mocking laughter that filled the room. His eyes were ablaze, no longer the calm and quiet boy he usually was. "What are you talking about?" The room suddenly fell silent, as if no one expected the farm boy, the black kid they used to look down on, to dare stand up to Miss Whitmore. But Miss Whitmore showed no sign of hesitation. On the contrary, she took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her high heels clicking against the floor with authority. When she stopped right in front of him, just inches away, Jacob could see her eyes, cold, with no trace of wavering or shame. "If you don't want to be laughed at," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "then prove it." Jacob gritted his teeth, feeling like the whole class was closing in on him in an invisible trap. Eyes were still locked on him, some students looking confused by the situation, but most were just waiting to see how he would react. Miss Whitmore continued, her voice dropping lower, each word feeling like a needle in Jacob's ear. "Otherwise, get out. There's no place for people who don't know their place here." The whole class froze in unison. No one said a word, but the atmosphere shifted dramatically. This wasn't just a criticism of his academic performance. This was a public humiliation, a message that didn't need to be hidden. "You don't belong here. You have no value here." Jacob could hear a soft laugh from the front row. Ethan was standing there, arms crossed, tilting his head, a smug smile curling his lips in victory. Jacob clenched his fists, feeling his dignity being ripped apart in front of everyone. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to stand up, to fight back, to shout in their faces that he wasn't a useless little boy. But then a cold realization washed over him like a bucket of ice water. He had no right to do that. If he reacted strongly, the only thing they would remember was a black kid who lost control. If he shouted, if he let the anger take over, they have an excuse to call him aggressive, out of control, unworthy of being educated in a place like this. They wanted him to get angry. They wanted a reason to prove he didn't belong here. And Jacob wasn't going to give them that. He took a deep breath, loosened his grip, and began slowly packing up his books, not saying a word. No one expected him to do that. No response, no argument, no begging. Just silence, heavy with meaning. Because nothing is more frightening than the silence of someone refusing to play by someone else's rules. Miss Whitmore blinked, a brief moment of confusion flashing across her face, as if she had expected a different reaction from him. But Jacob simply slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked out. Another mocking laugh echoed from somewhere behind him, but this time, fewer voices joined in. Jacob walked past the desks, his head held high. He didn't look down, didn't show any sign of weakness, But inside him, a fire had ignited, and this time, it wouldn't be easily extinguished. The classroom door slammed shut behind Jacob with a harsh, dry sound. He didn't look back, not wanting anyone in the class to see the furious expression on his face. He walked down the long hallway, where the early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting rays onto the white-tiled floor. But all it did was make him feel even more out of place. His heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from the boiling frustration inside his chest. Miss Whitmore hadn't just humiliated him in front of the class. She had deliberately insulted his roots, his ancestors, his history. And the most painful part was that no one in the class stood up for him. Jacob gritted his teeth, trying to control his breath, to keep from unleashing his anger. He knew if he lost control, if he let his emotions take over, the rumor about the crazy black kid in class would spread throughout the school in no time. Inside the classroom, as soon as Jacob had left, a wave of chatter erupted like a crashing wave. He actually left. I bet he'll never dare to come back. Ridiculous, thinking he could learn with us. The wealthy white students laughed mockingly. Ethan Carter, the leader of his group, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, enjoying the scene as if he had just seen an excellent comedy show. Pathetic, he thought. He thought he was important. Ethan smirked, then lowered his voice in a sarcastic tone. Maybe he's crying in the bathroom now. His friends burst out laughing, some slamming their hands on the desks, adding to the gleeful atmosphere in the room. Miss Whitmore stood at the front of the class, not intervening, not saying a word to stop it. She simply looked down at the class, her eyes gleaming with a hint of satisfaction, as though she had just completed an important task. She had always believed that some people didn't belong in places like this, and if Jacob Miller was too stubborn to realize that, she would help him understand by humiliating him right in front of everyone. But in the classroom, not everyone was laughing. The few black students lowered their heads in silence, too afraid to speak up. They didn't dare confront Ethan, didn't dare challenge Miss Whitmore. Some felt that something was wrong, but they didn't have the courage to say it out loud. A black girl sitting by the window, Alyssa Johnson, gripped her pen tightly, biting her lip, trying to hold back the words she wanted to scream. She knew that if she spoke up, she'd be the next target. A Latino boy, Miguel, stared at the blank page in front of him. Part of him wanted to shout at Miss Whitmore, to tell her she had no right to insult Jacob like that, but reason told him that if he did, he'd be in deep trouble. They had all seen this happen too many times before, and everyone knew one simple rule. If you didn't want to become the next victim, stay silent. Miss Whitmore, seemingly unaware of the tension in the room, turned toward the blackboard and picked up a piece of chalk. Let's continue. She had no idea that a storm was already beginning to form. In just an hour, news of what had happened spread throughout the school. In the cafeteria, the library, outside on the basketball court, wherever students gathered, the topic of conversation was Jacob Miller and Miss Whitmore's history class. Students like Ethan and his friends gleefully spread the story, adding their own details to make it even more humiliating for Jacob. He just stood there, speechless, couldn't say a word. Ethan exaggerated, recounting the incident. Then, when Miss Whitmore hit him with the truth, he just quietly packed up and left, like a little mouse. Laughter erupted around the lunch tables. A few students, though they didn't agree with Ethan, laughed along to avoid being seen as siding with Jacob. But not everyone was laughing. Some students began to feel uneasy, not because they felt sympathy for Jacob, but because they sensed something wasn't right. A senior, Brian Thompson, overheard the story in the gym, and he felt a discomfort stir in his chest. Not because he liked Jacob. They had never spoken to each other. But because he knew if this could happen to Jacob today, it could happen to anyone tomorrow. The gossip spread even further, reaching a young teacher, Mr. Anderson. When he overheard a group of students whispering about what had happened, at first, Mr. Anderson didn't think much of it. But as he listened to what was being said, he froze in shock. They never got the chance to learn from their ancestors. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He knew that if he didn't do something, no one else would. But the real storm began when the news reached someone beyond the school, someone Miss Whitmore could not ignore. Clara Miller, Jacob's mother, received a message from a friend about what had happened. When she read it, she froze for a few seconds, unable to believe her eyes. Then she made a phone call. That phone call wasn't to the teacher or the principal. She called her father. And just a few hours later, a black helicopter took off from a ranch on the outskirts of Texas, heading straight toward Westfield High. The Texas dawn was just breaking, the early sunlight casting down upon the grand buildings of Westfield High, creating a perfect picture of a prestigious school, a place where equality only existed on paper, and those in power always assumed the right to decide who deserved respect. But today, what shattered the stillness wasn't the bell signaling the start of class, or the bustling sounds of students at breakfast. It was a deep, slow, but powerful sound, shaking the entire football field. The sound of helicopter blades. A sleek black helicopter, shining like a massive black gem, descended from the sky, slowly lowering its altitude. Strong gusts from the blades blew dust and dry leaves into the air, forcing dozens of students to shield their eyes and duck down to avoid the debris. The engine roared like a declaration. Westfield High had never witnessed anything like this. Students rushed out onto the football field, gathering in groups, eyes wide, staring at the descending helicopter. Some pulled out their phones to record, some pointed and whispered loudly, while nearby teachers stood frozen, bewildered, unsure of what was happening. The helicopter door swung open, and a black man stepped out, James Miller. His tall, imposing figure was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, sharp seams running down his frame, and polished leather shoes that reflected the sunlight. His face was angular, the wrinkles on his forehead not aging him, but rather adding to his commanding presence. Some teachers gaped, not in surprise at the scene, but because they recognized who he was. James Miller was no ordinary farmer. He was a legend in the Texas agricultural industry, the owner of hundreds of farms across the state, providing organic food to the largest supermarket chains in the country. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a reformer, an entrepreneur, a symbol of rising from poverty. And today, he wasn't here as a school benefactor. He was here to seek justice for his grandson. Right behind him stepped Jacob Miller. Gone was the tired, bowed head from yesterday. Today, Jacob walked with a different posture, his eyes fixed straight ahead. There was no more shame or humiliation, only resolve. Whispers erupted everywhere. What's he doing here? Oh my God, don't tell me this is because of Jacob. I bet something big is about to happen. On one corner of the football field, Ethan Carter and his group stood frozen. He wasn't laughing anymore. He knew exactly who James Miller was. And what scared him wasn't the idea of Jacob being vindicated. It was the fact that, for the first time in his life, he felt fear. While the students remained frozen in place, James Miller walked directly toward the main school building, where the principal and teachers were waiting, bewildered. The principal's office door swung open. Principal Richardson, a white man in his 50s with neatly combed gray hair, stood up, forcing a professional smile that clearly masked his tension. Beside him, Miss Whitmore stood stiffly, her hands unconsciously clenching as she watched James Miller enter. No one in the room needed to guess why he was here. James Miller didn't need to beat around the bush. I hear my grandson was humiliated in class. His voice was warm, but there was no trace of leniency. The room froze. Miss Whitmore blinked, trying to hide her confusion. Mr. Miller, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. James Miller didn't let her finish. He pulled a check from his vest pocket and placed it on the desk in front of Principal Richardson. Do you know who funded the school science lab? No one answered. Who invested in the history program that Miss Whitmore teaches? Who contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure this school has the best resources? Principal Richardson swallowed hard. Miss Whitmore's face turned pale, her lips tight. James Miller nodded slightly, as though confirming something he had already known from the start. Then, he turned his sharp gaze on Miss Whitmore. So, you think you have the right to humiliate my grandson just because he doesn't look like the other kids here? The silence in the room was thick, so heavy that no one dared to even breathe loudly. Jacob stepped forward, his voice no longer trembling like the day before. I don't need privileges. All eyes were on him. I just want to be respected like everyone else. Miss Whitmore turned away, avoiding Jacob's gaze. She knew very well that she had been wrong, but she also understood something else. Today, she wouldn't be in control of this situation anymore. James Miller smiled faintly, glancing at the principal one last time. I hope you understand. My family doesn't need pity, doesn't need any special treatment. We only need one simple truth. Respect isn't based on skin color or background. It's based on character, on intellect, on what a person contributes to society. Principal Richardson couldn't argue because he knew James Miller was right, and the storm was just beginning. The atmosphere in the office was heavy and suffocating, as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. When James Miller spoke his first words, Miss Whitmore sat stiffly in her chair, her face pale, her lips tightly pressed as if trying to contain her panic. She hadn't expected it to go this far. She'd only thought she was teaching a stubborn black boy a lesson in knowing one's place, a lesson about who truly holds power in this world. But now, she realized she had misjudged Jacob Miller. She hadn't just humiliated a poor boy. She had touched the grandson of one of the most powerful men in Texas. Sitting across from her was Principal Richardson, a middle-aged man with carefully combed salt and pepper hair and a well-pressed dark blue suit. But now he was sweating. His fingers gripped the armrest of his chair as his eyes flicked nervously toward James Miller, as if trying to read the man's thoughts. Next to the principal were two other teachers, one male and one female, who had witnessed everything but had not dared to speak up in defense of Jacob when it happened. They just sat there silently, as if afraid that any movement might drag them into the storm that was about to unfold. James Miller stood in front of the principal's desk, a blank check placed right before Richardson. No one dared to touch it. I hear my grandson was humiliated in class, James said, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight that no one could ignore. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was an undeniable fact. The principal swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down his spine. He understood all too well that James Miller was not someone he could afford to disregard. Miss Whitmore took a deep breath, trying to regain her lost confidence, but her voice lacked the certainty it once had. Mr. Miller, I've always treated all of my students fairly, she said. A long silence followed. Then, James Miller gave a thin, humorless smile, his gaze sharp enough to make Miss Whitmore subconsciously tighten her grip on her thighs. Fairly, he repeated, his tone carrying a subtle mockery. Fairly enough to humiliate a child in front of the entire class? Fairly enough to use history to degrade his very origins? Miss Whitmore opened her mouth, intending to say something, but James Miller gently raised his hand, silencing her. He pulled out a check and placed it on the desk with a soft thud, but it was enough to startle everyone in the room. Do you know who funded the school's laboratory? He asked. No one spoke. Who invested in the history program you teach? No one dared to meet his eyes. Who contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure the school had the best resources? This time, Principal Richardson swallowed nervously, trying to maintain his composure. Mr. Miller, he said, we greatly appreciate the contributions you and your family have made, but it was me. James Miller cut him off, his voice firm. The atmosphere in the room froze. The other teachers gasped, and Miss Whitmore lost all color in her face. They all knew Westfield High had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Miller Foundation, but they had never imagined that James Miller was the one behind all those donations. James Miller stood tall, his presence enough to command attention without the need to threaten. I invested in this school because I believe in education. I believe every child, regardless of their background, deserves the opportunity to learn, to grow, to succeed. But yesterday, one of the teachers paid with my very contributions to humiliate my grandson, using history. Miss Whitmore bit her lip, unable to find any words of rebuttal. Jacob stepped forward, his voice steady, no longer trembling as it had the day before. I don't need privileges. All eyes turned to him. I just want to be respected like everyone else. Miss Whitmore turned away, avoiding Jacob's gaze. She knew very well that she had made a mistake, but she also understood something else. Today, she would no longer control the narrative. James Miller gave a small, cold smile and looked at the principal one last time. I hope you understand. My family does not need pity, does not need any special treatment. We just need one simple truth. Respect does not come from skin color or background. It comes from character, from intellect, from what one contributes to this society. Principal Richardson couldn't argue because he knew James Miller was right, and the storm had only just begun. James Miller held his sharp gaze, unwavering for even a second. He looked straight into Miss Whitmore's eyes without hesitation, without an ounce of mercy. You humiliated a child because of his background. His voice didn't need to be loud, but each word struck like a direct punch. No beating around the bush, no avoiding the truth. No one in the room could ignore the weight of his words. You mocked my grandson while using my family's money to teach. Those words lashed out like a whip against Miss Whitmore. She stumbled, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her face as white as if she had just been stripped bare before the world. In all her years of teaching, no one had ever confronted her like this. I didn't mean anything bad, she stammered, her voice faltering, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to hold on to. Nothing bad. James Miller raised an eyebrow, slowly repeating her words as though he himself couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The room was dead silent. Principal Richardson was sweating. The other teachers didn't dare speak, all of them holding their breath, waiting for what might happen next. Let me ask you again, so I can better understand your nothing bad explanation. James Miller lowered his voice, but it only made his words sharper. Did you, or did you not, ridicule Jacob in front of the entire class, turning him into a laughing stock? Miss Whitmore swallowed hard. I just wanted to teach him a lesson about hard work. About hard work. He chuckled darkly, but his eyes showed no trace of humor. Are you teaching hard work to a child who wakes up at 5 a.m. to work on his family's farm? A child who finishes a physically demanding job and still comes to school every day to learn like the other kids? Miss Whitmore couldn't respond. Do you think Jacob doesn't know what hard work is? James Miller continued, his eyes never leaving her. Do you really believe that a boy who has had to work twice or 3 times as hard as the other kids in this school just to be in the same class with them needs you to teach him about hard work? Each of his words came down like a hammer, each one shattering her weak defenses. She couldn't counter him because deep down, she knew she was wrong. But her silence didn't mean she was willing to admit her mistake. I don't discriminate, she said, her voice trembling but trying to hold firm. I treat all my students equally. James Miller tilted his head, his sharp eyes sweeping over her one more time. Equally? Have you ever told a white student that their ancestors didn't need to learn history? Miss Whitmore bit her lip, her arms trembling slightly. She couldn't answer because she knew the answer was no. Have you ever told a wealthy student to drop their studies and go back to working for their family? Miss Whitmore gritted her teeth, her hands clutching the edge of her skirt as if trying to hold herself back from saying something foolish. She couldn't counter him because the truth was too clear. James Miller nodded as though he had just proven his point. He turned to Principal Richardson, who was still standing frozen, sweat beading on his forehead. And you still think there's nothing wrong here, Principal Richardson? The elderly man tried to regain his composure, but his voice still shook. Mr. Miller, I assure you that our school does not tolerate any form of discrimination. If there has been any misunderstanding. James Miller laughed, a mocking smile spreading across his face. If I hadn't been here today, if my grandson wasn't my grandson, would you still consider this a misunderstanding? Principal Richardson couldn't answer. James Miller extended his hand, pointing to the check on the desk. Do you know how much I've invested in the school? No one in the room dared to respond. More than $500,000, he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of a definitive statement. Principal Richardson flinched slightly. He knew the Miller family contributed a substantial amount to the school, but he had never paid much attention to the exact figure. This isn't about money, James Miller continued, his voice slow, but as sharp as a knife. I didn't come here to withdraw my donation. I don't need to threaten you with money. I came here to ensure that no other child has to go through what my grandson went through. Miss Whitmore bit her lip, her face now as pale as paper. She had lost, Not just a debate, but something far more important: her honor, her position, and her power. Principal Richardson knew he couldn't let this slide. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and turned to Miss Whitmore with a heavy gaze. "Miss Whitmore, I think we need to reconsider your teaching methods." The teacher clenched her fists as if she wanted to protest, but found herself unable to say anything. James Miller looked her in the eye one last time, then slowly stood up. He didn't need to say anything else, because the truth was already painfully clear, and the storm he had brought with him had left irreversible consequences. The air in the room was as tense as a guitar string pulled to its limit. Everyone could feel that all the power Miss Whitmore once had, the authority she had shown over her students, had now turned to dust. She was no longer in control, no longer the one who could dominate the situation with a cold voice and a condescending gaze. She lost her power the moment Jacob stood up and said what no student had ever dared to say to her before. Jacob stood there, strong and determined, his deep black eyes showing that nothing could make him falter. He took a deep breath and spoke in a calm but resonant voice, as if addressing an entire system, a society too accustomed to discrimination and injustice. "I don't need privileges. I just want to be respected." All eyes were on him, but this time, no one dared to laugh. No one dared to mock him as they had the day before in the classroom. Those in the room had witnessed Jacob's public humiliation, heard Miss Whitmore's cruel words, and seen the embarrassment he had to endure when he walked out of the classroom. But they also saw him standing here today, unbowed, not begging, but demanding the bare minimum of what any human being deserves: respect. Miss Whitmore, who once felt she held life and death in her hands with students like Jacob, could not look him in the eye. She fumbled, her hands trembling, gripping the hem of her skirt as though looking for something to hold on to. But nothing could save her now. And then she did something she had never done with any student. I'm sorry, Jacob." Her voice was dry, lifeless. There was no sincerity, no real remorse, but she knew she had no other choice. In all her years of teaching, she had never been forced to utter such words. But today, she no longer had control. She had to admit her mistake before a student she had once looked down upon. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, staring at her, as if trying to see through the facade of someone who always thought they were right. A heavy silence enveloped the room. Everyone present could feel the weight of this moment. Finally, Jacob nodded slightly, not to accept the apology, but to acknowledge that the apology had been said. He didn't need the apology. He had never needed it because an apology couldn't erase what had happened. It couldn't erase the times he had been mocked. It couldn't erase the feeling of being looked down upon in a classroom where he was also supposed to belong. But he had regained the most important thing: his self-respect. Principal Richardson sat there, feeling the heat of the situation. He had never faced an event like this in all his time running Westfield High. His school had always been a place for the children of the powerful, where rules were written by the wealthy, and those who didn't belong to that class had two choices: remain silent or leave. But today, everything was no longer in his hands. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his authority. "Jacob," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "we will have a meeting with the school board to thoroughly review the teaching methods and conduct of our teachers. We will also implement training programs on equality and respect for students to ensure that something like this never happens again." Jacob nodded, but he knew that words alone meant nothing without action. He didn't stop there. He took another step forward, his voice still firm. "And Miss Whitmore?" The room froze. No one spoke, but everyone understood what he meant. If there was no form of discipline for Miss Whitmore, then what had happened today would mean nothing. Miss Whitmore clenched her fists as if trying to maintain her composure, but Jacob knew she was terrified. Principal Richardson glanced at Miss Whitmore, then took a deep breath. "We will have an internal meeting to review Miss Whitmore's actions and determine the appropriate disciplinary action." This time, Miss Whitmore jumped in surprise. She didn't think things could go this far. "Principal Richardson, She tried to say something, but he raised his hand to stop her. "Miss Whitmore, I think it's time for you to reconsider your teaching methods." She stiffened but couldn't argue because, for the first time in her life, She no longer had control. Jacob took a deep breath, then slowly turned and walked out of the room. He didn't need to say anything more because he had won. Not because his grandfather was wealthy, not because he had someone protecting him, but because he dared to stand up for himself. And from this day forward, nothing would ever be the same again. From that day forward, everything changed. It wasn't a sudden change, like flipping a page in a book, nor was it a revolution that instantly turned everything upside down, but rather, it was like an underground stream, slowly weaving through every corner of Westfield High, gentle yet unstoppable. Jacob walked down the hallway with his head held high, no longer looking down, no longer hurrying to avoid the gazes of those who once mocked him. He didn't have to avoid anymore, nor did he need to pretend to be invisible among the vast halls filled with privileged rich kids. No more whispering laughter behind his back, no more snide remarks as he entered class, no more contemptuous glares cutting into his self-esteem like silent knives. Those who once ridiculed him now dared not open their mouths, not because they had suddenly become good people, nor because they truly regretted what they had done, but because they knew Jacob was no longer the fragile target he used to be. He was no longer the boy who would silently bow his head and accept the humiliation without resistance. He had stood up and reclaimed his dignity, and they knew that if they continued to look down on him, they themselves would be the ones deserving of contempt. Ethan Carter no longer stood in Jacob's way in the hallway, no longer crossed his arms with an arrogant half-smile, no longer threw harsh words wrapped in a tone of power and mockery. He was still there, still carrying the old, outdated thoughts and invisible hatred for those he deemed unworthy of his world. But he no longer dared to express it openly. He knew that this time, if he continued, it wouldn't just be a harmless joke that he could get away with. Not just Ethan, but his entire group of friends had become more cautious. Those who had once joined in laughed and used Jacob as a joke to make themselves feel more powerful no longer acted with the same boldness. They looked at him, but no longer with glaring contempt. Instead, there was a glance mixed with weariness, discomfort, and perhaps, though they would never admit it, a bit of respect. Their silence didn't come from remorse, but from the fact that they no longer controlled the narrative. They were no longer the ones who could decide who mattered and who didn't. They had lost the invisible power they had once gripped so tightly, unknowingly. But the change didn't stop with the bullies becoming quiet. Other students in the school began to look at Jacob differently. Some he had never spoken to. Those who had once simply viewed him as a shadow among hundreds of other students now started paying attention to him. Some who had never thought to greet him as they passed by now nodded subtly when they caught his eye in the hallway. No one said it aloud, but Jacob could feel the difference. Not everyone had changed completely. Not everyone had truly taken his side. But at least they had begun to respect him. They had started to recognize that he was no longer an invisible boy who could be dismissed without anyone caring. They had seen him stand up, witnessed him face those more powerful than him, and saw that he wasn't afraid, even in the most difficult situations. And that made it impossible for them to continue seeing him as the inferior person they once did. In class, things also changed. When Jacob entered history class, the room was no longer filled with whispers. No more eyes watching him with mockery. He walked to his desk and sat down, no longer feeling as though he was walking into a place where he wasn't welcome. No one was particularly friendly to him, but no one dared to see him as weak anymore. Miss Whitmore was still standing at the front of the class, still lecturing with her usual stern tone, but there was something different in her eyes. She no longer dared to call Jacob's name in front of the class, just to make him feel embarrassed. No more veiled comments. No more mocking words disguised as lessons about hard work. She no longer felt she could control him as before, because she knew that any action she took from now on would be watched, scrutinized, and judged by those who were no longer willing to turn a blind eye. No one knew exactly what the school board had done to Miss Whitmore after the internal meeting. She wasn't fired, nor was she suspended, but the change in her behavior was clear evidence that she had received a stern warning. While she might never truly change, at least she knew that she couldn't go on as she had before, without consequences. The students who had once been silent while Jacob was humiliated also began to change. Those who had once bowed their heads in fear not wanting to get involved, not daring to stand up to those more powerful than them, now started to realize that perhaps, for the first time, they could stand up for themselves. Some of the other students of color in the school began to feel something different. They no longer felt as alone as they had before. Some students who weren't as wealthy as Ethan and his group, those who had lived in the shadow of the rich and powerful, now began to realize that maybe, for the first time, they too could have a voice. Jacob didn't know if it was true recognition or just a temporary shift, but he didn't care. He wasn't fighting to be recognized. He was fighting for himself. And that was enough. From that day on, Jacob was no longer just the farmer boy. He was no longer the one anyone could easily bully without fear of retaliation. He was no longer the child who always had to endure without a way to fight back. He was someone who had dared to confront injustice and not bow his head before it. And that no one could change. The news of Jacob Miller receiving a scholarship spread rapidly across Westfield High like a fresh breeze. No one expected that a black boy, the son of a farming family who had once been mocked and humiliated in class, could step onto the stage to accept such an honorable reward. Some were surprised, while others whispered, trying to figure out why a student like him could achieve what many of the rich kids in the school longed for. But no matter what they said, the truth remained unchanged. Jacob was no longer an outsider. He had earned his place. The scholarship ceremony took place in the large auditorium, where chairs were neatly arranged and bright lights shone down on the stage, where Principal Richardson stood, holding the certificate. He seemed to have not fully shaken off the pressure of the recent events, but today, his voice rang out clearly. It was no longer the voice of someone with absolute power, but the voice of a person who had learned that sometimes justice does not come from written rules, but from those who dare to stand up and change them. Today, we honor a student who not only excels academically but also demonstrates a strong spirit, perseverance, and the courage to face challenges. The auditorium fell silent as those words echoed. No one was confused about who he was referring to. Some students glanced at each other, some raised their eyebrows, but no one spoke out in protest. This scholarship is not just for those with the highest grades, but for those who have proven that knowledge is not something that can only be measured by tests or grades, but also by how they face adversity. And no one deserves it more than Jacob Miller. Applause erupted. It started off scattered, but then gradually spread throughout the room. Jacob walked up to the stage, keeping his head high with no hesitation. He took the certificate from Principal Richardson's hand, his eyes briefly scanning the audience, where familiar faces were looking at him with varying expressions. Some eyes held respect, some admiration, and some were uncomfortable. Those who had once looked down on him, who never thought he could achieve this. Ethan Carter sat in the middle row, his face stiff, his eyes darkening. He had never been used to seeing someone surpass him, especially someone he had once considered beneath him. Jacob could feel all those gazes, but he didn't care. He wasn't standing here to prove anything to anyone, nor did he need recognition from those who had never believed in him. He stood here for himself, for his effort, for everything he had endured and overcome to get to this point. He looked down at the front row, where his grandfather, James Miller, sat. His grandfather's gaze was filled with pride, but not surprise. He had never doubted his grandson's abilities, never thought Jacob needed his help to achieve what he deserved. He was simply here to witness Jacob claim it for himself. Jacob turned back to face the audience. He wasn't one to speak in front of crowds, but this time, he knew he had something to say. I'm not standing here today because of luck or because I have more privileges than anyone else. The room fell completely silent. I am here because I had to fight for myself, because I learned how not to bow down to what's wrong, because I learned that respect isn't something others give you. It's something we have to earn. Everyone listened in silence. I wasn't born with an easy life. I didn't have the opportunities that many in this school have, but I never let that decide my worth. Jacob looked directly into the crowd, his eyes bright, unwavering. And I hope those like me, those who felt they didn't belong here, will understand that no one has the right to tell you if you're valuable or not. Only you can decide that. The auditorium stayed silent for a few seconds. Then a round of applause began. This time, it wasn't out of reluctance. nor was it merely a courtesy gesture. It came from the truth that Jacob had proven. He deserved everything he had earned. He stepped off the stage, his heart light, but full of pride. Not because he had won the scholarship, not because he had made those who once belittled him silent, but because he had done something not everyone dares to do. He had stood up for himself, and he had won. From that moment on, Jacob was no longer just a farm boy, no longer just a black student at a school for wealthy children. He wasn't just a bright student or a hard worker. He had become a symbol of perseverance, of self-respect, and of the spirit to fight against injustice. And no one could deny that. Ethan Carter sat in the middle row of the auditorium, his back against a chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his fingers gripping so hard they were almost turning white. He didn't clap. He couldn't. While the entire auditorium stood to applaud Jacob, while those who once looked down on him now looked at him with respect, Ethan felt like he was being pushed to the edge of a world he had once controlled. He didn't understand how everything had changed so quickly. Just a few weeks ago, Jacob was still a nobody, the son of a farmer, a kid who didn't know his place, while he, Ethan, was the one on top, surrounded by people always ready to follow him, laugh with him, do whatever he wanted. But now, when he turned to look at his closest friends, he no longer saw the certainty in their eyes. No more satisfied smiles, no more self-assuredness, as though they were still the center of everything. Some still sat there, trying to act normal, but others had clapped along with the crowd, though not too enthusiastically, enough for Ethan to realize that they were slowly drifting away from him. No one said anything, but Ethan could feel it more clearly than ever. He was no longer the strongest person in that room. The next day, when Ethan walked into the schoolyard, he realized that everything had changed in a way he couldn't control. The students who had once laughed with him when he mocked Jacob, those who had echoed his cruel words, now avoided him. No one said anything directly. No one confronted him face to face, but he could feel that their gaze toward him had changed. Some looked at him with indifference. Others walked past without greeting him as they used to, and some stood near him, but no longer initiated conversation. Ethan could feel the isolation creeping and like an invisible circle tightening around him. He walked into the cafeteria during lunch, trying to keep up his usual demeanor, trying to act as though nothing had changed. But when he passed a group of students sitting together, he overheard whispered comments behind him. "He's the one who mocked Jacob. I heard his grandfather embarrassed him right in class, but he's regretting it now." He gripped his tray tightly, but didn't dare turn around to confront anyone. Before, he could easily threaten someone if they dared speak ill of him. But now, everything was different. No one stood by him like before. No one saw him as the one with absolute power in the school anymore. Ethan sat down at a corner table in the cafeteria, trying to pretend that he didn't care about what was happening around him. But even those who had once been his closest friends were no longer the same. Andrew, who had once been his right-hand man, only gave a small nod when he saw him sit down, then turned to continue talking to another group. Chase, who had laughed the loudest every time Ethan mocked Jacob, only glanced at him for a second before burying his head in his phone. No one wanted to be seen as too close to him anymore because now, Ethan was no longer the one who could control everyone, because standing with him was no longer a safe choice. Those who had once mocked Jacob were now realizing their mistakes. Some didn't dare to say anything, didn't want to face the truth that they had been wrong. But others, even though they didn't speak up, began to feel that something was off in the way they had treated Jacob. Alyssa Johnson, the black girl who had stayed silent when Jacob was humiliated in class, no longer felt comfortable with her silence. She remembered that moment when she could have spoken out but didn't, when she had bowed her head, pretended not to hear what Miss Whitmore had said, tried to convince herself that staying out of it was the best option. But now, seeing Jacob walk proudly across the schoolyard, no longer the boy who had been crushed before, she realized that she had been wrong. One day, she approached Jacob as they both left the library, hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I'm sorry." Jacob looked at her, slightly surprised, then asked, "For what?" Alyssa was flustered, unsure of how to respond, but in the end, she said what had been on her mind for days. "For not speaking up when I should have." Jacob looked at her for a long time, then nodded slightly. "You're not the only one." He didn't say it with bitterness or anger. He just said it as a fact, because he knew that in this world, too many people chose to stay silent when they should have stood up. But at least, some were beginning to learn how to face their mistakes. Westfield High hadn't changed completely overnight. Old ideas, prejudices, and discrimination still lingered, creeping through the hallways, classrooms, and whispered conversations. But one thing had definitely changed. Silence was no longer the obvious choice. The students who had once been afraid now saw a clear example that if one person was brave enough to stand up, they could change the story. And those like Ethan Carter, those who had once believed they could dictate the worth of others, now understood that the world no longer revolved around them. Ethan sat alone in the cafeteria, looking around, realizing that no one surrounded him like they had before. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be isolated. And for the first time, he understood a little bit of what Jacob had gone through. Jacob's family was not just a farming family. They were successful entrepreneurs, living proof that skin color does not determine a person's worth, and the most powerful rebuttal to the prejudices that have been rooted in society for centuries. The Miller name was not only associated with the vast fields of Texas, but also symbolized perseverance, unwavering determination in the face of adversity. For a long time, James Miller had ceased to be just an ordinary farmer. He was the man behind an agricultural empire stretching across the southern United States, having built a farm system that supplied organic food to some of the country's largest supermarket chains. He wasn't just a farmer. He was also a strategist, a leader, a pioneer in the field of sustainable agriculture. But few knew what the Miller family had to endure to reach this point. James Miller was born on a small farm where his grandfather had worked as a laborer on white-owned land, where his father had been denied a loan simply because of his skin color, where James had heard his mother cry quietly every night, worried about whether they would have enough money to feed the family the next day. He had grown up in a world that constantly told him people like him had no place in business, could never be leaders, and could never change their fate. But he didn't accept that. He worked tirelessly, not just on the fields but also in boardrooms where he faced weak handshakes, suspicious glances, and fake smiles full of disdain. He learned to read the expressions of those who believed he could never succeed, and then he proved them wrong. Now, when people spoke of James Miller, they didn't just mention the man who owned hundreds of farms. They spoke of someone who had changed an entire industry, created thousands of jobs for the community, and stood up to ensure that future generations of people of color would no longer live in the shadow of discrimination as he once had. And Jacob Miller, his grandson, was the one continuing that legacy. After receiving a prestigious scholarship, Jacob was no longer just an ordinary student at Westfield High. He became a well-known name, not just in school but also in the community. Local newspapers wrote about him, about his story, how he stood up to injustice, how he earned respect through his own abilities. The parents who had once looked down on his family now viewed the Millers with a different eye. Whispers buzzed in parent meetings. I never realized the Millers had such influence. I thought they were just an ordinary farming family, but it turns out they're stronger than many rich families in the city. This really changed my perspective on them. The kids who had once mocked Jacob now sat at the same table with him in class, no longer daring to avoid him or throw contemptuous looks his way. Some even tried to strike up conversations, wanting to be friends, not because they had truly changed, but because they realized Jacob was no longer someone they could look down on. But Jacob didn't need their flattery. He wasn't fighting to be recognized. He was fighting to change his own story, so no one could impose the limits they had set upon him. One afternoon, while Jacob was helping his grandfather check a new shipment at one of the family farms, he received a call from an unfamiliar number. At first, he thought about ignoring it, but something urged him to pick up. "Hello, this is Professor Carter from the University of Texas." Jacob was surprised. He knew the University of Texas was one of the most prestigious schools in the region, and Professor Carter was a well-known name in the field of agricultural science. "I read about your story in the news. I'd like to invite you to tour our agricultural research department. I believe you have the potential to further develop in this field, and I'd like to offer you a full scholarship if you're interested." Jacob could hardly believe his ears. A full scholarship from one of the top universities? He took a deep breath, looking out over the vast fields in front of him, where the sunlight bathed the rows of trees in golden hues, and the familiar scent of damp earth filled the air. He knew he was born to be tied to this land, but he also knew that he was not just a farmer. He was the one who would inherit his family's legacy, the one who would continue the path his grandfather had paved. He gripped the phone tightly, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you, Professor. I'm honored. I'll think about your offer." Hanging up, Jacob turned to his grandfather, who stood there with a warm smile. He didn't need to ask who Jacob had been talking to because he knew his grandson had already begun walking his own path. "Do you remember what I once told you?" James Miller asked softly, his eyes gleaming with pride. Jacob nodded, remembering the words his grandfather had told him when he was young, when he hadn't fully understood their meaning. "We weren't born with privileges, but we can create our own. No one can decide your worth except you." Today, he truly understood that. Jacob was no longer just a student who had regained his honor. He wasn't just someone who fought against the injustice at school. He was someone who had proven that skin color does not determine a person's worth. He was the one who would continue the path his grandfather had walked, but in his own way. And he knew that this was only the beginning. Jacob not only reclaimed his dignity, but also inspired many others. He didn't know when it started, but the students who had once stayed silent began to speak up about the things they feared. He didn't know when those who had avoided him had started to look directly at the injustice they had pretended not to see. All Jacob knew was that as he walked down the school hallway, he no longer felt like an outsider, not because everyone liked him, but because he had earned the respect he truly deserved. People like Ethan Carter were no longer the center of everything. He was still there, but he was no longer the one everyone had to fear, no longer the one who could judge others without being challenged. He and his friends, who once rallied together for mocking games, no longer had a crowd surrounding them as before. The smug grins had disappeared, replaced by a quiet discomfort, an isolation that had once been Jacob's to endure. But no one made Ethan go through it. No one sought revenge, and no one tried to push him down. It was simply that everyone had realized Ethan no longer deserved to be seen as a leader. It wasn't just students like Jacob who realized they could stand up. Even others understood they could no longer turn a blind eye to the injustice. The black students in the school started speaking about their experiences, about the times they felt pushed aside, about the times they had to prove their worth. Other students, those who hadn't directly experienced discrimination, also began questioning their own mindset. Alyssa Johnson was no longer the quiet girl who had stayed silent when Jacob was humiliated. She began speaking up, starting to engage in discussions about equality at school, becoming someone other students turned to when they felt mistreated. Miguel, the Latino boy who once kept his head down to avoid trouble, stepped up as one of the first to suggest creating a club for black students in the school, where they could share their experiences and work together to change things. And even teachers like Mr. Anderson no longer stayed silent. One day, after class ended, he kept Jacob behind. "You know," he said, his voice deep but sincere, "I used to think that as long as I taught well, did my job right, that would be enough. But you've shown me that silence is never enough. If I don't stand up when I see something wrong, then I'm no different from those who let it happen." Jacob didn't say anything, just nodded slightly because he knew that real change wasn't about one person standing up, but about when one person has the courage to rise, they'll bring others along who will do the same. On the day Jacob graduated from high school, his grandfather came to the school, standing from afar, watching his grandson walk up on stage to receive his diploma. James Miller had never been one to easily show his emotions, but anyone could see the pride in his eyes. When Jacob looked down, he caught his grandfather's gaze, and in that moment, he understood that he hadn't just reclaimed his dignity for himself, but had also continued the legacy his grandfather had built. After the ceremony, when the two of them stood side by side, looking at the school grounds one last time, Mr. James placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, his voice deep but firm. "You did well, but this is just the beginning." Jacob looked up at the vast sky, where birds were soaring, and he understood that his grandfather was right. There was still so much injustice in the world, so many barriers to break, and so many people who needed someone to stand up and lead the way. But Jacob was no longer the boy who was afraid, who doubted himself. He had learned something more important than anything else. Stand up for yourself, because you deserve respect. And Jacob Miller, once looked down upon, once mocked, once told he didn't belong, now walked with pride, with the belief that not only did he belong in this world, but that he could change it. And he would. Jacob Miller's story wasn't just a journey of reclaiming his dignity. It was a testament that respect doesn't come from skin color or background, but from character and effort. From a boy once mocked in class, Jacob rose up, not only to defend himself, but to inspire others to face injustice. He changed how people viewed the value of a person, forcing those who once ridiculed him to fall silent, and helping those who were once afraid realize they too could speak out. So what about you? If you found yourself in Jacob's shoes, what would you do? Would you stay silent and accept it? Or would you find the courage to stand up for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your opinion matters. If you love this story and want to see more inspiring content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next amazing story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.